to go through all of the brands and see the novelties and enter them into our database, which contains information on over 43,000 fragrances. Today, Michael would have loved to have been here. We're still a little bit protective of Michael, and we're kind of not allowing him to travel just for his health, and COVID is still upon us and around us. So I drew the short stick and was sent to Milan to do the work. But what we've done is we've created a little video for you. So Michael has shot a video talking about his fragrance wheel. He's going to talk about the 14 different fragrance families that we have in the wheel, and also give you some examples of some fragrances that you can try at the exhibition which are relevant to each of those families. So without further ado, we'll play the video. Michael will be joining us live after the video. It runs for about 40 minutes, and he'll be happy to take any questions that you have that will lead us up to 1:30. So we can start the video if we're happy to go.
Hello, my name is Michael Edwards, and thank you for joining me today to explore the fragrance wheel. I created it 30 years ago to make sense out of perfume. Fragrance fascinates, but it also frustrates. The key problem is that there's no common fragrance language. The brands, the perfumers, each describe their fragrances quite differently. And when you add to that the avalanche of new fragrances, it's a real problem. 20 years ago, there were 435 new fragrances. 10 years ago, 1,500. And last year, 2,700 and more. It's no wonder that Allure magazine once said that finding the right fragrance is almost as hard as finding the right partner. It seems an almost insolvable problem, but in fact, it's quite easy to figure out the fragrances that anyone is most likely to like. If you were to ask people for the names of their 3 or 4 favorite fragrances, almost invariably you'd find that at least 2 of them belong to a single fragrance family. And if you happen to come across somebody who gave you 4 different fragrances and they belong to 4 different families, all that would tell you is that they must love perfume, because there's no way in the world that they could have developed so broad a taste without trying a lot. Ask for more names, and invariably you'll find that 1 or 2 of the fragrance families hold a special appeal. That's what makes it easy to suggest the fragrances that people are most likely to like. And so in exploring the fragrance wheel, I'm first of all going to go through the broad groups, the florals, the ambery, the woody, and the fresh fragrances. And then we're going to look at them family by family within those groups. To start the ball rolling, the florals, I'm selecting Chloe. It's a typical floral, a classic with the rose kind of notes. If you were to compare that to an ambery fragrance, such as Shalimar, for example, you'd find that the queens of perfume are so dominant, so heady, so spicy, so vanillic in many ways, quite different from the flowery scent of Chloe. And the contrast between a Shalimar and a woody fragrance like Terre d'Hermès is like day and night. You'll pick up that woody scent instinctively, immediately. And when you compare that to a fresh note, the citrus eau de colognes, for example, epitomized by Eau Sauvage, you'll pick up the freshness of the citrus fruits, the citrus peel, and the citrus juice there. These are the pioneers of perfumery. The very first alcoholic perfumery was created in 1709. I know that often an older fragrance, Eau de la Reine de Hongrie, Water of the Queen of Hungary, is said to be the oldest existing alcoholic perfume. It wasn't the case. It was essentially rosemary flowers that had been seeped in wine alcohol. The problem is that until the end of the 1600s, the chemists couldn't distill wine alcohol to remove the stench, the smell of stale wine. And that's why the Eau de la Reine de Hongrie was really an aromatic, herbal medicine and not a perfume. It was in 1709 that a Cologne perfumer, Giovanni Maria Farina, created the first eau de cologne. He called it Eau Admirable de Johann Maria Farina, and he wrote to his brother to say, "I have discovered a scent that reminds me of a spring morning in Italy, of mountain narcissus, orange blossom just after the rain. It gives me great refreshment and strengthens my senses and imagination." At the time, this was the ultimate niche product. Here it is in the green bottle, is the original bottle dating from 1709. I once spent some time in the Farina archives in Cologne. They're the oldest in the world, dating back to the 1500s. And I came across an invoice dated 1712 for the sale of one bottle to a merchant prince in Munich. The cost was 1 Reichsthaler, which is what the average merchant would have expected to earn in a week. I think, imagine the cost of that product then. Why were people willing to pay for it? Well, if you remember your history, people weren't very happy with bathing back at that stage. They felt that if they bathed, they opened the pores of their skin, miasma would come in and they'd get ill. And so they'd have to be hauled kicking and screaming maybe once, twice, 3 times a year at the most to bathe. Life was very stinky back then. Can you imagine the impact of being able to splash some of this Eau Admirable on a cloth and wipe it all over your skin? The feeling of freshness coming through. Wow, it was incredible. Well, what was the secret of it? Well, it was a citrus fruit, bergamot, from the south of Italy, Calabria. Still the key product used in perfumery today. No, you can't cut it or eat it or drink it. It's purely used for the oils in perfumery there. Within the quartet of great eau de colognes, we have 4711. You'll be interested to know that the name was not originally 4711. William Mullins had bought a formula from a Bonn perfumer that was called F. Maria Farina. Yeah, I know it seemed to be a knockoff, but in fact, remember, trademarks were a lot different back then there. It wasn't until in the turn of the century, last century, that the package we know as 4711 and the name 4711 came into being. Then you have, in 1806, Jean-Marie Farina. Yes, it was a great-grandnephew of the original Farina, opening up in Paris under the name Roger and Gallet, Jean-Marie Farina. And then finally, in 1853, the great quartet concluded with Eau de Cologne Imperial, the first imperial appointment for a Guerlain fragrance. And it was really the history of that quartet that influenced the development of eau de colognes for the next 200 years, until in 1966, Edmund Rudnitzer, the great perfumer, created Eau Sauvage. He transformed eau de colognes, instead of being just light, refreshing, transitory scents. He kept the freshness, he kept the depth, but he made it last and created the great iconic fragrance of Eau Sauvage. The one that I've pulled out as an example that you'll find at the fair is Bergamotto by Laboratorio Olfativo here. Well, we've looked at the fresh notes. We've looked now at the citrus notes. Let's move to the next part of the wheel, logically, the water notes. The water notes are a new family. They started in 1990 with the launch of New West for Her. New West for Her pioneered an ingredient that had been used in perfumery but never in fine perfumery. It was cologne. Cologne is a synthetic note that was discovered and was widely used in laundry products. It's the smell of fresh linen, or at a more concentrated stage, the smell of electric air. If you can imagine going out on a boat at sea and a storm comes and the electricity is in the air and the lightning is striking, it's that electric scent of wet air that was cologne. New West was the first to try it in 1990. It didn't work very well. They used it at a level of 5%, and people sensed there was maybe too watery, too too almost like seaweed or oyster-like for their taste. But the next year, Escape lowered the dosage of cologne and came out with a fragrance that was remarkably successful. It was developed by Anne Gottlieb, who said that clean is the new synonym for sexy. And so cologne became the signature of the 1990s. It also gave rise to probably the most successful of all men's fragrances at the time, Acqua di Giò, put on there. Now, from Goldfield and Banks, we have a contemporary example in Pacific Rock Moss. From the citrus, through to the water notes, through to the green family is the logical sequence. In 1947, Vent Vert pioneered the green notes, used a dosage of galbanum so strong, so dominant, people either loved it or they hated it. I put, when I was doing my classification, the green notes quite separate from the florals. The perfumers, for example, tend to think of green fragrances as being a subgroup, a subnote of florals. I've got no problem with that. If, for example, you take pleasures, it's a floral with, imagine a blouse of green. No trouble at all. But the moment you push the green to a point that it becomes so green, so grassy, we were finding that people who liked florals were put off by that. It was just too aggressively green for them. And that was why when I constructed my classification way back in the 80s, I put the greens as a separate family, the real greens, typified, for example, by Vent Vert or Aldehydes on this one. Here in the fair, a contemporary example from Boyce 1920, Come la Luna, an interesting new example of the green notes. So from citrus, through to water, through to green, logically into the fruity, and the great classic of Ralph Lauren. It is fruit and fruit and fruit diving into fruit. You'll find here in the exhibition Belle Rebelle's Peach Me as a modern example of a niche fruity note. So I've covered the basic of the first group. That's the citrus, the water, the green and the fruity. Let's now move then on to the florals. Dominant floral notes such as Joy by Jean Patou, the classic created in 1930. It was created originally as a gift. This came out at the height of the aftermath of the 1929 stock market crash. Patou's main clients were Americans, and so many of them had lost their family fortune that they were unable to travel to Paris for the couture shows. And he asked his perfumer Almaraz to create this fragrance as a gift to bring a little joy into their life. It wasn't until 1932 that in fact joy was actually sold within the Patou boutique there. I've used a more modern example such as Chloe. At the fair, then there's an interesting one, Rosa Sacra by Frasai. Turning to the new book which is to be released at the fair, you're going to see a change. Since 1984 we have come out with an annual edition of Fragrances of the World. The last 4 editions, there were so many fragrances we were forced to compartmentalize, segment. So the last edition focused on luxury, niche and prestige fragrances with a sprinkling of celebrity. But even that has got too much. The book was so big, it's almost like we needed a horse and cart to bring it to you. This new edition marks a change. In future, we will be listing all the new fragrances for a 2-year period. This one is for the year 2020 and 2021. It follows the format of the earlier books. So if you look at each family, you'll see that each family is divided into 4 notes: fresh, crisp, classical and rich. What do I mean by that? Well, when I was starting to put the guide together, my starting point were the classicals, the typical fragrances in each family. Think of Joy or Chloe, typical floral, rose note. For a soft floral or an aldehyde, number 5 is a typical example. A floral amber note would be Oscar de Laurento. A soft amber note, opium, An amber note would be chalybeate. These are typical fragrances of each family, but how do you describe fragrances that are in that family but don't smell typical? You know, they say that if you think long enough about a problem, the answer came. And in this case, it did. I woke up early morning one night, and the answer was there. We talk about fragrances being fresher or richer, fresh or rich, and I thought, why don't I use that as a guide? So let me explain what I mean by this. A classical floral, a classical single floral would be a rose. If you were to compare it to a rich floral, like a tuberose, they both smell flowery, but by comparison with a rose, the tuberose would have a deeper scent. The tuberose is a smell of fracas. And if I compared fracas to, for example, Chloe, on the dry down, remember that my classifications are dry down, not top note, because that tends to be merely an introduction to the perfume and tends to disappear quite quickly. But the memory of the perfume is the dry down. Compare those two and you'd actually smell the note getting deeper. If I try to sing, and forgive me, I'm not very good, but I'll put it together. Chloe the classical, fracas the richer note there. If I showed you a fresher interpretation, for example, a gardenia by Micallef, and made it even fresher into a lily of the valley note, such as Diorissimo, if you were to compare those four, your nose would step down a staircase of Diorissimo the freshest, down to Gardenia the crisp, down to Chloe the classical, and down to Fracas the rich. I know it sounds fanciful, but it worked. And it means that when you look at the guidebook, you can almost instinctively know how any individual fragrance is going to smell. Well, we talked about the natural fragrances, the flowers. Where do the synthetics come in? I know most people tend to think of the synthetics are poor relations, nasty smells. It's not true. They're the heart and soul of modern perfumery. For us, a great perfume is most probably a heart of the finest naturals on a skeleton of innovative synthetics. It was from the 1850s onwards that the perfumers and the chemists became fascinated with the chemical storehouse in nature. As they were able to pull apart nature, they found so many new scents. For example, if you pull apart the scent of jasmine, you'll find that nature has actually put together over 800 different scents in what we smell as jasmine. It's impossible to extract each of them. Cost would be horrendous. But once you've chemically identified them, then you can clone them. And so for us, the first modern perfume was Jiki of 1889. When asked why he included some of the then new synthetics, Aimé Guerlain, the perfumer, said, because they give me an effect I couldn't find in nature. And so now I want to explore a family that owes its whole character to the combination of florals and a particular family of synthetic notes, the aldehydes. The aldehydes were discovered and in use from about 1903. If you can imagine the smell of coriander, that would be very similar to some of the smells of the aldehydes. Some smell like an freshly ironed, almost burnt linen. Others smell with a sharp, almost metallic, sparkling kind of scent there. But they both give an effect in fragrance that is so strong, so sparkling, that you need to soften it. And we use there things like iris root, not the iris flower, but iris root and musk. And we create a fragrance that the perfumers call the floral aldehydes. I call the soft florals. Why? Because if you've ever worked at a counter and told somebody about a marvelous new floral aldehyde, you'll have picked up very quickly that puzzled look in their eye. And of course you can't resist, so you feel the need to explain all about the aldehydes, and you've gone in about 5 ways, waxing lyrical about synthetic notes, and you can see the look of boredom in their eyes, and a sale is lost. At the end of the day, you're going to discover that all the floral aldehydes end up with a soft, almost powdery note. If I turn them into a picture, this is what it would look like. The scent of a floral aldehyde. We call it a soft floral. Classic, of course, would be Chanel number 5. I'm not going to focus on telling you the marvelous story of Coco Chanel. Instead, let me focus on Ernest Beaux, the creator of this masterpiece in 1921. If you're interested in the full story, you'll find it in my book, Perfume Legends. It was Ernest Beaux who, on his return from his service in Russia, he was French, but he was working in Russia for Raleigh, a French perfumery chain, and he joined the Allied forces, was sent to Russia, but on the return, he started work at the Raleigh plant in La Bocca, just outside of Cannes. And it was in his studio there that he received Coco Chanel in 1921. She was summering with her young lover, the Russian Grand Duke, and friends of hers at the Hotel Carlton. Initially, she was very reluctant to get into perfume. Yes, she'd registered the name Eau de Chanel back in 1919, but publicly she said she had no interest in perfume. But Beaux intrigued her with some of the essences he showed her, and she commissioned him to produce a selection of fragrances. The one that particularly struck her fancy was in a bottle numbered 5, and it was strong with aldehydes there. When he asked her what she proposed to call it, she pointed to the number on the bottle, number 5, and said, "I present my couture collection on the 5th day of May, the 5th month. So let's call it by that number. It'll bring it luck." And that was the story of number 5 there. You'll discover the full story in the book, but at the show, what we have is from Masque Milano, Lost Alice, as a contemporary example of a floral aldehyde. So in summary, we've looked at the fresh notes. In the floral notes, we've explored the florals and the soft florals. Let's move on now to the amber notes. Starting with the floral ambers, as the name implies, their basis is flowers, orange flower in particular, heady, sweet, spicy. When mixed with sweet spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, you get that marvelous blend of sweet, spicy, heady, floral, ambery notes, the floral ambers. The great classic, of course, was Le Bleu of 1914. But it wasn't until Oscar came out in 1977 that the family exploded. Don't ask me why. Le Bleu, unfortunately, has been forced to change so much by the new regulations, but the original one was a masterpiece of subtlety and softness. And then you had Tigresse from Fabergé, 1944. What about Belle of Versailles from Jean Dupré of 1962? They were beautiful fragrances, but none really clicked. It wasn't until Oscar's launch in 1977 that suddenly Floral Oriental started to take off. And if you look at my full book, you'll in fact see that within 6 months of Oscar coming up, there were another 27 new fragrances at launch. Within a year, they passed 30, 40, 50, and never stopped growing. At the fair, you're going to see a very interesting new one from Dosita. Now, my pronunciation is difficult on this. Anum Cara. My pronunciation of it is not as beautiful as the actual fragrance itself. Logically, the floral ambers will turn into soft ambers, soft by comparison with the true amber notes here. Classic example would be Youth Dew, 1953 from Lauder, reinterpreted with Opium in 1977, the blockbuster. The new Opium is a slight twist on the original Opium. You'll pick up the dry down, but the top notes in the new Opium, forced to because of regulation changes, will be a little different. But wait for it to dry down, and we pick up a remarkable similarity between the original Opium and the new Opium on this one there. Rossando Matteo has a very interesting new interpretation of it in his Incense Woods that you're going to smell at the exhibit. So from floral amber through to soft amber, through to true amber, you see the logical progression of the evolution of the fragrance families. So what is the basis of the amber notes? Okay, resins, heady, spicy resins that come from the driest parts of the world, where the scrubs barely live, but when you cut this, you find that they ooze a little resin that becomes hard. That is the core of the ambery fragrances. They have a heady kind of voluptuous, sensual kind of scent. Add them to vanilla and you've got a marriage in heaven there. Classic example would be a fragrance such as Shalimar. Obsession, a more recent interpretation of that, or at the show from Atelier Materi, Cacao Porcelano would be there. From the ambery notes to the woody ambery notes, the key difference is that in the woody amberies you're picking up patchouli and the potent notes of sandalwood to create that wooden amber note. I was responsible for this family because back in the 1980s, Givenchy came out with Isatis. Ah, said the perfumers, c'est un Chypre. It's another mossy fragrance. No, said Givenchy, it's oriental. Then came Passion in 1987. Ah, said the perfumers, c'est un autre Chypre. No, said Elizabeth Taylor as Elizabeth Arden. It's actually an ambery oriental. They were both right. And because I have to work and keep peace with both the perfumers and the brands, I divided floral orientals, floral ambers into two families. My floral ambers are strong in heady, sweet, spicy notes like orange flower. My woody ambers have the dominant notes of patchouli and sandalwood, the potent wood notes. This is the family of Cocamoselle. Take it to an extreme and add the gourmand notes and you'll create Angel. At the exhibition, have a look at Fan Your Fames from Nishane. So what about the ouds? For me, mostly they're part of the woody ambery notes, and at the fair, an interesting one is Oud Aquilaria by Omar Luxury. Let's explore then the true woody notes. So we've looked, just to remind you, we've looked at the fresh notes, that's citrus, water, green, fruity. We've explored the two floral notes of floral and soft floral. Remember that the florals have that crisp flowery note. By contrast, the soft florals are almost a softer, powdery, more interpretation. We've explored the evolution of amber notes from the floral ambers to the soft ambers that are soft by comparison with the true ambers to the woody notes. Now logically into the woods. The smell of wood and the classic note of this would be a fragrance Féminité du Bois by Serge Lutens. Came out in 1992. Originally it was a Shiseido fragrance and then it became part of the Palais Royal collection and then in 2000 was entered into the Serge Lutens collection. If you ask me for probably the greatest wood fragrance of all time, I'd have to say Féminité du Bois. Serge Lutens and Chris Sheldrake created a masterpiece of complexity and subtlety and beauty in the cedar wood fragrance. Oh, it's magnificent and really worthwhile wearing to explore it in detail. This week, visit Obvious. There's a fragrance en bois, but it's a lot more than just a wood. It's an interesting twist on the woody theme. Compare it to mossy woods, the family the French call Chypre. Where does the name come from? It's simply the French name for the island of Cyprus. Cyprus was renowned for its oak moss. It was widely used in perfumery. It's a moss that grows on oak tree and was a staple in French perfumery as early as the 1800s. But those early perfumes, none you would have liked. They all smelt very heavy, almost dank, because oak moss can overpower any other perfume there. It wasn't until Cody introduced a masterpiece, Chypre de Coty, in 1917, that suddenly mossy wood's fragrances changed and became wearable. Chypre de Coty was so influential that it gave its name to the family of Chypre or mossy wood's fragrances. It's long gone, but the closest to it is still available at Chanel, Pour Monsieur, created by Henri Robert. He loved Chypre de Coty and wore it himself. So who was Cody? The pioneer of modern perfumery, the most significant, influential man who created French perfumery at the turn of the 20th century. He wasn't born a perfumer, he wasn't born wealthy, he came from Corsica, a middle class but a family so poor that they couldn't afford for him to finish school. After he'd served his military service, he bumped around for some years and then went to Paris. He was given a job as a gopher by his army commanding officer, who by that time was the French Corsican deputy in the French Parliament. He didn't get any money. It was a case of board and lodging, and that was all. And so to make money, he worked at a chemist, a pharmacy. And back in those days, the pharmacies in France would be where you would buy your orange flower water, your lavender water, and the simple perfumes. Cody was given the job of looking after the perfumes. And he discovered he had a acute nose, acute sense of smell, and at the same time an acute critical judgment. He was horrified by the way in which the perfumers, no matter how elevated, packaged their perfumes. They would choose a cheap glass bottle, slap a flowery label on it, and probably use the same bottle for half a dozen fragrances. To him, a perfume was worthy of a treasure chest, and he became the first to commission great designers to create bottles. It was he who commissioned René Lalique to create the first Lalique perfume bottle. The more he worked, the more fascinated he became by fragrance. And by chance, one day at dinner, he was introduced by his patron to Antoine Cheris. Cheris was the owner of the largest supplier of oils, materials to the French perfumers. It was his company that owned the great plantations of vetiver and jasmine and tuberose and Bulgarian rose there. And on the basis of that brief meeting, Francois Cody, hot-footed, down to grass, and sought a meeting with Cheris. He had no appointment, so he was obviously refused, but the family recalls that he made such a fuss that after an hour or two, Cheris himself came out. Something about the young Cody must have intrigued him, because he invited him into his office, and a couple of hours later he came out and introduced Cody to Monsieur Robert, his production director, with the statement, "Please give Monsieur Cody whatever help he might need and credit." It was a remarkable thing that Cody had not only got credit but training from the greatest house of the time. He spent about 19 months there, and it was at a time when perfume was changing rapidly. Classically, the flowers had been cut from the gardens, and here on the right you'll see a picture of how lavender was harvested and distilled back at the end of the 19th century. You'll see on the right a worker bringing a whole pile of lavender and popping it into a copper sill. And then you'll see on the left the big sill on some bricks. And there'd be water put into it, a fire would be lit below, and as the water boiled, steam would come out and would carry some of the oil from the lavender. It would go along that pipe, drop into a wooden bowl, and oil and water would separate, and that's how lavender oil was processed. You probably wouldn't like it, because clearly the fire would have burned some of the flowers, and there'd be a slightly smoky smell, and it wouldn't smell very strong, but that to the perfumers was the scent of perfume in those days. Well, just before Cody enlisted at Cheris, the company had created one of the miracles of the new industrial revolution, a way of extracting the oils from flowers without using flame. The result was so dynamic that when Queen Victoria visited Grasse, she was invited to show the new facility. And the result was an oil so strong, so concrete, so different, they called it absolute. To the perfumers, it was so strong it smelt unnatural. They found it hard to work with. Cody knew no different. He just thought it was the most marvellous scent, and together with the new bases, he started to create his fragrances. His first masterpiece was 1904 Rose Jacqueminot, but it was the creation of La Vigan in 1905 that gave him his first iconic masterpiece. This was the grandfather, the grandmother, if you will, of all floral amber notes at the time. Compare it, if you would, to Le Bleu from Jacques Guerlain at that time. And here you had two master perfumers working side by side. Le Bleu was 1914, L'Oregon 1905. Was Jacques Guerlain influenced by L'Oregon? Clearly he knew of it, but they were both working in different directions. And when you look at Le Bleu, clearly Jacques Guerlain had taken something so different, but translated it into magic. Then came Chypre de Coty in 1917, and here Cody transformed the scent of mossy woods notes. By contrast, 2 years later, Mitsuko Jacques Guerlain took that same thing but transformed it with some fruity aldehydes to create a peach-scented interpretation. Was it a knockoff of Chypre de Coty? No, not at all. It was a reinterpretation of a new theme that François Coty had created. We tend to forget François Coty revolutionized ambery fragrances with the creation of Emeraude that was followed by Chalimard. Here we have two great perfumers neck and neck and neck creating masterpieces of perfumery at the time here. Coty became so successful that in today's money he became a billionaire many times over. He sought power and bought newspapers, but he bet the wrong way on the American stock exchange crash. His newspapers lost money, and eventually he played around so much that his wife divorced him. He died a sad and embittered man. Coty's influence outlived his death. Armand Petitjean, who had been his general manager, left him and created Lancôme, with no less than 5 fragrances for its launch. Serge Leflouis, who had been financial director of Coty's empire, in 1947 created Parfum Christian Dior. He had long been a friend of Christian Dior, and he'd also been an admirer of Chypre de Coty. It was a fragrance he wore, and that became the foundation of Miss Dior, the fragrance for the launch of Dior. Georges Beau, who had been Coty's commercial director, left to create Robbie Piquet, and afterwards Parfum Grès. Yves Saint Laurent was financed partially by Coty's American director. He had a lasting influence on the future of fragrances. You'll notice that I don't refer to the family under the name Chypre, but as mossy woods. Please, in France, obviously we call it Chypre, but in English-speaking countries, when one talks about Chypre, people tend to hear the name sheep and imagine that you've got a whole herd of woolly animals pattering around the perfume section. A contemporary example of a Chypre or mossy woods fragrance, have a look at Le Jardin Retrouvé. There's one that's called Mousse Arashiyama. Okay, from the woods to the mossy woods to the dry woods. These are the fragrances that you would probably call leather. The origin would be the birch trees of Russia. The Russian peasants used to cut the birch trees. As the sap oozes out, it would harden. They would scrape it off and use that to waterproof their leather boots. That's the origin of the Russia leather fragrances that you would find. A modern equivalent would be Aramis from 1963. A modern example at the fair would be Pierre Guillaume's Habanera. Then, as we move back to the start of the wheel, the aromatic fougères. These fragrances take their name from Fougère Royale, created in 1882 by Paul Parquet, one of the greatest of the early perfumers there. It proved successful as a soap, and 2 years later, 1884, he created a fragrance. Lavender was the core of it, together with a new synthetic note. Fougère Royale was probably the first fragrance to use a synthetic note that had been extracted from tonka bean, called coumarin there. And it remains the heart of fougère notes ever since. Now, within the wheel, in many ways, you can consider aromatic fougères as belonging to every family. because you're going to find that most people, regardless of whether they like florals or ambery notes or woody notes, also likes a fougere. Why? Because a fougere is a stew. You'll find it's got floral notes like lavender and geranium. You'll find that there's some fresh notes of citrus, bergamot, maybe a touch of green. You'll find like coumarine or ambery notes in the thing, and spices. You'll find woody notes. Put them all together and you create the scent that we call the aromatic fougeres. Apart from Fougere Royale, the modern equivalent was started again in 1964 with the creation of Brut. Brut had in fact come about from an older fragrance, Canoe, by Dana, that dated from the 1930s. But it was Brut that really transformed the whole of men's fragrances with its launch and promotion in 1964. If you've got any doubts about yourself, wear something else, was their statement. It was followed by Paco Rabanne's Pour Homme in 1976. Then came Drakkar Noir in 1982 and 1988 called Cool Water. Successive interpretations of this fresh, aromatic, zesty kind of scent. In the latest interpretation, we saw Bleu de Chanel and Sauvage, the widely successful fragrance from Dior. Now considered to be the most successful men or women's fragrance in the world today. And all of them have that feel that you find in this picture of freshness and lavender and zesty kind of notes. And that's why I put them at the beginning in the middle of the wheel. If, for example, you add waters, you'll get a watery fougere, such as Aqua de Jo. If you add ambery woody notes, you'll get a fragrance like Le Mal by Jean-Paul Gaultier. So you can almost take a fougere note and push any one of the families to give it an influence here. As a modern interpretation, have a look at Paris Monte Carlo with a Lavanda Romaine, a reinterpretation of a classical note. So to sum up, there are 4 major groups that I've identified: the floral, the ambery, the woody and the fresh. We can take the fresh notes from citrus through to water, through to green to fruity. Compare that to the floral touch of floral and the soft floral with its powdery notes by comparison. The evolution of the ambery notes from floral amber, soft amber, true amber, woody amber, and then moving on to the woody notes of woods, the mossy woods, the dry leathery woods, coming back again to the aromatics. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for your attention. Before I hand over to Michael, hello, Michael.
Hi, Vicky.
Hello. We wanted to, obviously, Michael spoke about his books, and they're very well regarded in the industry. He mentioned that there is a new guidebook, a new reference book, which we've about to launch, but you have the ability to pre-order from us, and an offer for everyone that's come along to Essence. If you'd like to take one of these cards, there's a promo code which will give you a discount, industry discount, which will give you some great reading, I think, for the new guidebook, plus also Perfume Legends, which Michael spoke about in his talk. But we can now go to questions and answers. We've got about 15 minutes. We have a mic roaming around the room, which will allow Michael to hear you. And are there any questions that we can take for Michael? We have one at the front.
Hello, Michael. It's Danielle.
Hello.
It's always a very large pleasure, big pleasure to listen to you and your knowledge, so thank you again.
Thank you.
I was very curious to see that the woody ambery families have grown greatly, notably in the niche segment, artistic perfumery in the recent years. And if I'm not wrong, so you will know even better than I do, but if you add the woods, the woody amber, and the amber families, it accounts almost for 40% of new fragrance launches in artistic perfumery. And my question would be the following to you. Focusing on niche, so more the artistic segment, do you note and perhaps predict the emergence of a new type of family in the next potential years or decades. And perhaps...
Oh, I love you. I love you.
Oh, thank you. And me too, Michael. So I'll hand it over to you. Thanks. Is the question clear?
There is always the initiative to create a new family as though it's marvelous. Should we create a new family? I don't think so. It needs something extraordinary to come up with a new family. I mean, the green notes with, in the 1940s with Vent Vert, that was something that we'd never smelt before. That's logical. Angel, for example, came out 1992. Some people, French Society of Perfumers, consider it woody. I consider it a woody amber fragrance, and so does Olivia Cresp, who created it there. Why do the French consider it woody? Because they don't actually have a woody oriental family, a woody amber family. And that's why they tend to pop Coco Mademoiselle and Angel as woody fragrances. But it's not a woody fragrance. It's got that ambery undertone. So are we likely to see a new family? Look, if you had argued that the gourmand notes deserve a family of their own, I'd say I understand and I could go along with you. I've chosen not to put the gourmand notes in a single family. To me, I regard them as accents. I see floral gourmand notes, soft floral gourmand notes, floral amber gourmand notes, ambery amber gourmand notes. So that's where we're looking at the moment. And I'm always intrigued by what you might be interested in with a new family.
Maybe I don't see any new family emerging just right now. What I'm noting though, and also after talking to Clayton and an interesting comment he made this morning, we do smell a little bit more freshness in some of the new launches. And I was wondering if we would be seeing a few more new launches, less in the woody ambery, maybe woody notes, but more in the freshness, maybe also in parallel to our desire socially to open up and for some more lightness. So it was just asking also the question, not so much perhaps of a new family, but of what are the new launches showing in the artistic perfumery? Are they more going in the direction of the citruses or a form of lightness? Do you note that also when you evaluate new fragrance launches? And it's just I was curious from a social trend point of view.
Lovely thought.
Okay,
Lovely thought you put up there. Yes, I think it's inevitable that we're going to see fresher interpretations. If you look back over the last 10 years, the woody amber notes have become more and more intense and deep, and oud has crept in there. It's almost too deep for many people. And so I think you're right to pick up the lightness that I sense will be emerging. One of the beauties about niche perfumery is that it's not a hit-me-over-the-head kind of fragrance. That to me is more mass market. But there have been a number of instances where it is so strongly hit me over the head that you wonder. So yeah, I think you're pretty right that we're bound to see more lighter, fresher, woody amber notes.
Maybe if I can just add to that, our quarterly insights newsletter comes out for the second quarter, which will include all of the data that we've collected here at Essence. So that'll be really interesting to see the ratio between some of those fresher families and the traditional woody amber families. Yeah. Any other questions for us?
There have to be some questions. I can't cover everything, so please, I'd be delighted if you asked.
We've kept Michael locked up for 3 years, so he's ready to talk.
It was back in 2019. We spent Christmas at home in Paris, and my wife flew back in January to open up the Sydney house. And then COVID struck, and I took one of the last planes out of Paris. I never thought I would be stuck in Sydney, which has been great to work with the team for kind of 2 3/4 years. The one great thing that I can tell you about Some of you may have heard that after Perfume Legends, I've been working on American Legends, tracing the evolution of American fragrances. I can tell you it's finished. It's now being checked with all the perfumers and designers that I spoke to. It goes to Paris next week to produce the index and then the layout, and I'll be back in November, and it'll be released in September 2023. Oh, I know it sounds a long time, but you know, book publishing is like an extended pregnancy.
We have a question from Stephen.
Sorry, Michael, Stephen Gray here. Very nice
Hello.
to see you.
How are
I'm
you?
here with Tabitha, who was very sorry to miss you and hopes that you're better. You're certainly looking better.
Oh, no, I'm fine, thank you. It's just that they keep me away from lots of people, you see, that's why.
My question is one that we've spoken many times about the importance of the perfumer and the development of perfumes as opposed to the market itself. Artistic perfume tends to drive the development from the perfumer's desk rather than the marketing rooms. So my question is, the move to lighter perfumes, if I dare call citrus fresh perfumes in that category, how much of that do you think is driven more by the perhaps move from the traditional established markets of the Middle East, where there's very, very heavy fragrances, and the market development and the understanding in the more Western world of lighter fragrances and fresher fragrances? So how much is driven by the marketing expansion as opposed to the perfumers themselves?
I think you put your finger on it, Stephen. I sense that niche perfumery is more and more going to be influenced by marketing factors. And you'll probably hang me up and dry, but nevertheless, in the 1970s, there were 17 niche fragrance houses launched. In the 1980s, there were 17 niche houses launched. Remember, it was only L'Artisan Perfumery in 1978 that really initiated it. Diptyque had come out in 1969, but they'd only had one fragrance. It wasn't until the success of Jean-François Laporte's L'Artisan in the 1970s that suddenly Diptyque started to add fragrances at that point. Penhaligon's, of course, was contemporary with L'Artisan in the 1970s, and Sheila Pickles, who renovated the house, had come out with some interesting stuff. But still it was tiny, nobody knew about them all. In the 90s, we track 18 new niche houses. And then as the noughties and social media expanded in the year 2000, 2010, we can hardly credit it, but we've tracked over 1,800 new niche houses coming in. Now, when you've got such a quantity, you've got marketing forces. I suspect that the trend to lightness is not seeking to go back to the eau de cologne notes of Europe, but rather inspired by the rising interest of fragrances in the Asian market, particularly China. We're working at the moment with Tmall on a program of fragrance finders, and I'm fascinated as I explore the Chinese market at the sheer number of fragrances coming up from boy bands and the youth. You may dismiss them. There's some very interesting notes coming out of that. I suspect that China in particular is going to prove more and more a very influential factor in the new development of lighter fragrances.
We have 3 minutes. Is there any other questions that we can end on? No? Okay. Well,
Then allow me, if I may, just to wrap up for just a few minutes.
sure, please, Michael.
When you visit Niche, when you visit Accents, you're becoming part of our future. If you look back, Charlie changed everything in 1973. Before Charlie, men bought fragrance for women. Women rarely wore it except on high days and holidays. Charlie changed it. After Charlie, women bought perfumes. The impact of opium. Imagine the incredible renaissance of fragrance in America in the 1970s with Halston and Giorgio and Obsession and Red Dawn. In the 90s, we saw the celebrity fragrances. Passion, with its launch in '87, had created such an impact that every Tom, Jane, and perfume house wanted to come up with a celebrity. In the 25 years after Passion, we tracked, believe it or not, over 650 new celebrity fragrances. But the problem was the complaints multiplied. Fragrances don't smell as long, they said. They don't last as long. They don't smell as good. And they were right. Anne Gottlieb, the great evaluator who developed all the Calvin Klein's fragrances, once said that the problem was that in order to pay the celebrities, the brands had to cut back the quality of the perfume. They made it cheaper, or they put less in the bottle. And you know, if we look back, as the new century dawned, perfume was in trouble. It just didn't smell as good. It smelled fake. It smelled old. It smelled different. It was Niche who rescued it. Niche gave us luxury into fragrance. In many ways, going back to the luxury of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. The one fear I have now is that when you've got so many houses competing left, right, and center, marketing is going to dominate, and maybe some of the authenticity had will disappear. I urge you, if you're a niche manufacturer, remember, you are now part of a luxury field, and you can't con people. Luxury is luxury because it deserves to be pleasure. So to all of you, my very best wishes for a great show at Accents. I wish I were with you, but I'm with you in spirit, if not in body. Clayton, and to all of you, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And as I mentioned, the card is here. If you'd like the promo code, please take one of the cards with you.
Thank you, Clayton.
Thanks, Michael. See you soon.